It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Philippe Copeland, who is a clinical assistant professor in the School of Social Work and the director of the dual degree program in social work and theology. Professor Copeland received his BA in legal studies and philosophy from the University of Massachusetts, his MSW from Simmons College, his MTS in theological studies from Harvard University, and his PhD in social work from Simmons College. Professor Copeland's scholarly and practical interests include mass incarceration and social work practice, implications of the movement for Black lives in social work practice, social work for racial justice and equity, and theories of justice. Please welcome Professor Copeland.
Hi, thank you so much. And because I have issues with memory, I'm going to rely on my notes a little bit more than my colleagues. So I appreciate your patience. All right. The United States is exceptional in many ways. One of these is subjecting more human beings to state captivity and control than any other country on the planet. We have 5% of the world's population and 25% of its incarcerated population. Over 2 million people in America are in prison, about half of them for drug crimes. On any given day, 700,000 people are held in jails, 75% for nonviolent offenses. There are 7 million Americans either in prison, on probation, or on parole, again, mostly for selling or using drugs. This remarkable number of people living under varying degrees of captivity in the land of the free has been referred to by some as mass incarceration. Now, the sheer scale of mass incarceration would be appalling for any nation claiming to value freedom. However, we also know that this phenomenon is far from colorblind. There are more African Americans under correctional control today, in prison or jail, on probation or parole, than were enslaved in 1850, 10 years before the Civil War began. The United States incarcerates a higher percentage of Black men than South Africa did at the height of apartheid, and African Americans are jailed 4 times the rate of white Americans while making up only 13% of the population. But mass incarceration is more than the numbers. That's what we usually hear about. It also represents interlocking belief, value, and social systems that create a caste system. I refer to these interlocking systems as a matrix of mass incarceration. This includes mass incarceration mentality, morality, and machinery. Mass incarceration reflects both conscious and unconscious belief systems that become embodied in personal behavior and public policy. Unconscious biases associate people perceived as belonging to certain groups with criminality. This is the psychological criminalization of groups, one of the ways in which people are transformed into those people. You ever hear about those people? You may have met some of those people. You might even be those people, right? Mass incarceration mentality also reflects conscious ideology. In its conservative, liberal, and yes, radical forms, this ideology treats prohibiting and punishing behavior as the default solution to problems. As the old saying goes, when all you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. So for decades, we have pounded on those with mental illness, substance use disorders, and addiction, pounded on those living in poverty, pounded on those who are poorly educated, pounded on, yes, children and adolescents, and pounded on those crossing borders for a better life. Needless to say, all this pounding has broken more than it has fixed. Mass incarceration morality has endowed the pounding approach to problems with the vigor of imagined virtue. Once people become those people, subjecting them to historically unprecedented captivity and control becomes not only permissible, but obligatory. Society must be protected from those people at all costs. The machinery of mass incarceration includes all the places and processes through which we pound away at our problems. This includes racially biased discipline in schools that channels our children and youth into the criminal justice system, the so-called school-to-prison pipeline. Overly aggressive policing, often through racial profiling, also plays a role. Excessive punishments through mandatory minimum sentencing and three strikes laws are critical cogs in this machinery. And another is the collateral consequences for felony convictions that can block access to employment, housing, and public assistance. Mass incarceration mentality and morality keep this machinery well-oiled. Of course, the matrix of mass incarceration did not come from nowhere. At the heart of the matrix are historical processes. Things like the development of policing as a tactic for managing enslaved Africans, along with slave codes that became black codes after emancipation, effectively criminalizing blackness itself. This criminalization of a people, my people, left us vulnerable to labor exploitation through convict leasing, which some have called slavery by another name. And later, the conflation of crime, urban uprisings, and civil disobedience during the 1960s that provided a rationale for law and order liberals and conservatives to declare a war on crime that would become a war on drugs in the 1970s and 80s, and intensified during the 1990s, even as the overall crime rate was actually beginning to fall. These historical processes and others have created a new form of caste system in America. So what do we mean when we use the term caste system? Michelle Alexander, author of The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, has defined a caste system as, quote, a stigmatized racial group locked into an inferior position by law and custom. This caste system has serious consequences. As a social worker specializing in behavioral health, I've been most concerned with the impact of mass incarceration on the psychological and social well-being of its survivors. As you can imagine, the cost of caste in terms of community mental health has been very steep. This has taken a variety of forms. One is the impact of aggressive policing itself. Anybody hear of the phenomenon stop and frisk? We usually talk about this in terms of its constitutionality, in terms of issues of individual liberty. People have started looking at the actual psychological impact of stop and frisk encounters. So I'm going to tell you about that. In a survey of young men ages 18 to 26 in New York City about their encounters with the police and subsequent mental health, participants who reported more police contact also reported more trauma and anxiety symptoms. These symptoms were associated with the number of the stops, the intrusiveness of the stops, and perceptions of police fairness. 5% of participants in this study reported being stopped more than 25 times. 1% reported being stopped over 100 times. 100 times. Now, if you're fortunate enough to be locked up with a relatively healthy mind, you still have to adapt to the conditions of captivity. This has been referred to by scholars as prisonization. Prisonization includes experiences like hypervigilance and distrust of others, needing to be in control of your emotions at all times because you can't show any kind of weakness, being withdrawn and isolating, adopting exploitation of others as normative and a diminished sense of self-worth. In addition to adapting to captivity, many spend periods of time in solitary confinement for up to 23 hours a day with little to no human contact from days to decades. I want to say that again, from days to decades in solitary confinement. Not surprisingly, human beings who are kept under such conditions experience anxiety, panic, and rage, paranoia and hallucinations, loss of impulse and emotional control, and hopelessness and depression. Of course, we also know that many people go into our jails and prisons already suffering some form of mental illness. The number of inmates with serious mental illness in prisons and jails exceeds the number of those in psychiatric hospitals tenfold. In 44 of the 50 states and in DC, prisons and jails hold more mentally ill people than the largest remaining psychiatric hospital. Many of us have started to say that our jails and prisons are the new asylums. Now, in addition to the impact of this caste system on individuals is its impact on families. One study found that incarceration prevents the meaningful interactions and physical and emotional bonds necessary for successful marriages and increases stress on free family members due to financial stress and the stresses of managing a home. These stressors increase the risk of divorce, with 40% of these divorces happening after incarceration has ended. So at the very moment when having a life partner could be most precious and meaningful, you're at higher risk of losing that person than when you were actually incarcerated. Mothers who've had a child with a recently incarcerated man have been found to be over 50% more likely to be depressed, again, because they've often lost a breadwinner and also a co-parent. Anybody here trying to raise a child by yourself? I could not do that under the best possible circumstances, and that has nothing to do with my partner being put in a cage, right? So imagine what that's like for those for whom that is true. By some estimates, there are over 2 million children with an incarcerated parent. Every war has its orphan. These are our orphans of the drug war. 20% of black children have a father with a history of incarceration. Children with parents in captivity are twice as likely to develop a mental disorder and are at greater risk of school failure, underemployment, and illegal drug use. Parental incarceration undermines children's sense of stability and safety, their sense of connectedness and worthiness, and ability to form attachments and trust others, including other adults who might have to care for them. And if this were not enough, children with incarcerated parents are twice as likely to have other adult family members who are incarcerated. So if we are all in cages, who is left to care for our children? If we are all in cages, who is left to care for our children? Now, beyond the families, the immediate families, the caste system harms the minds of friends and relatives as well. In one study, those with a friend or relative in prison within the last 5 years rated their mental and emotional health more poorly, had more days in the past month where poor mental or emotional health interfered with usual activities, and reported experiencing more stress and depression. Ultimately, this caste system compromises the psychological and social well-being of entire communities. Scholars note that in the communities hardest hit by mass incarceration, we see a breakdown in the social networks and relationships needed to achieve goals through connection to others, and a breakdown in civic engagement through decreased trust in government and the sense that the community is not entitled to the norms of citizenship itself. I'm going to say that again. The community does not believe that they are entitled to the same rights as other citizens, whether they have committed a crime themselves or not. Think about the implications for democracy. I wanted to close by saying that if you are in any way moved by what I have shared with you, I hope you will join us in the civil rights struggle of our time, not only to free the people from this caste system, but also to help them to heal from its consequences. Thank you. So, questions? You may feel like you were held captive yourself for 15 minutes, right? Any questions? Yes, sir.
Is there a model system that you like anywhere in the world that you think is a good system? Like that's, I mean, clearly our system is bad, but is there a system
I mean,
that
there's been a variety of pieces done on the ways that in which some European countries are trying to deal with issues of incarceration. So certainly there are countries who do it differently. For example, the sentencing, sort of the severity of punishments in many of these countries is much less severe than us. one of the things that we started to do, particularly in the 80s, was that for all crimes, not just drug crimes, we became much more punitive, which meant that everybody was going to be spending much longer periods of time in prison than ever before. So one of the things that we can do, that we can learn from Europeans, is really thinking about what is an